The morning broke slow and sullen over the plains, the kind of light that seeped through clouds like water through a rag, staining everything with a pale silver glow. The land stretched wide and empty, a quilt of dust and brittle grass, and the silence carried the weight of a place long accustomed to hunger. Elias Boone stepped out of his cabin into that half-light, boots grinding against the frost-tipped earth. His barn loomed hollow beside him, timbers gray with age, its doors yawning open as if to remind him of all it lacked. He stood for a moment, hands resting on his belt, shoulders hunched beneath the cold, and listened to nothing but the wind. It was a sound he knew too well. Elias had been a man of promise once, tall, broad, a figure who might have carried a family's fortune on his back. But time had a way of grinding down the edges of a man, and in this town of whispering saloons and judgmental stares, he had become less than the sum of his years. They called him unlucky. Cursed, some said, after a fire took his herd 3 winters ago. He lived now in a world of suspicion, where the townsfolk looked on with pity laced in scorn, and he endured it by holding his silence. It was easier to say nothing when every word invited more gossip. The day stretched in chores that felt hollow, water carried from the well, would split though the stack was already high, a fence line walked with no cattle to contain. The sun climbed, but even it seemed reluctant to shine too brightly on him. By dusk, Elias's body carried the weight of work, yet his spirit felt no lighter. He saddled his horse, intent on riding the perimeter one last time before night, a ritual he performed more for distraction than necessity. It was then, as the horizon bled red and the wind carried the scent of dry sage, that he heard it, a sound so faint he thought at first it might be the cry of some animal. A whimper, broken and desperate, leaking from the shadows near the barn. Elias slowed his horse, ears straining, his hand instinctively brushing the butt of his revolver. The sound came again, fragile as glass. He dismounted, boots sinking into dust, and stepped toward the dark outline of the barn. Inside, the shadows thickened. The smell of hay mixed with something sour, a human scent gone unwashed too long. His eyes adjusted slowly, and in the far corner, half collapsed against a beam, he saw the shape. A child. Barefoot, clothes torn into rags, face hollowed by hunger. The boy's skin was dusky, his hair long and tangled, and his eyes, dark as obsidian, watched Elias with a mixture of terror and defiance. For a moment, neither moved. Elias felt his chest tighten. He had seen children broken by hunger before, but never one so still, so thin, so close to being swallowed by the silence of the earth. The boy tried to push himself upright, but his limbs betrayed him, trembling like reeds in the wind. Elias crouched slowly, palms open, speaking low, though he knew his words might mean nothing. "You'll break yourself trying," he said softly, voice rough from disuse. "Easy now." The boy's lips moved, no sound at first, then a whisper, one word in broken English, like a stone scraped against metal, "food." Elias's throat ached at the sound. He reached into his coat pocket, fingers fumbling for the heel of bread he had carried all day. He set it on the dirt between them and waited. The boy stared at it as if unsure whether to trust it, then, with a sudden burst of strength, crawled forward and snatched it up. He tore at it with his teeth, chewing with desperate, clumsy hunger. Elias sat back on his heels, watching, his chest heavy with a sorrow he had no words for. He had fed cattle, dogs, even a dying horse once, but never had the act carried such weight. Watching the boy eat, he felt the edges of his loneliness bend, as if a space long sealed in him had been forced open. He stood slowly, voice caught in his throat, and motioned toward the cabin. The boy's eyes narrowed with suspicion, but hunger won out, and he followed, staggering like a shadow barely tethered to flesh. Inside, the cabin glowed dimly with the light of a fire Elias had stoked earlier. He set a pot on the hearth, beans simmering in their thin broth. The boy sat near the flames, shoulders curled inward, his eyes darting to every corner of the room as though memorizing it for escape. Elias ladled food into a tin bowl and slid it forward. The boy's hands trembled as he took it, the spoon clinking against the rim. For a while, the only sound was the soft scrape of metal and the crack of burning wood. Elias said little. He watched the boy eat, the flicker of the fire catching in those dark eyes, and he wondered what road of misfortune had driven him here. Yet he asked no questions. Questions, he knew, were heavier than answers, and the boy looked too fragile to carry either. When the bowl was empty, Elias poured water into a tin cup and placed it in front of him. The boy drank, then leaned against the hearth, exhaustion rolling over him like a tide. A silence stretched between them, not empty but fragile, like the pause between heartbeats. Elias studied the boy's face, saw the dirt crusted along his cheek, the hair that fell into his eyes, the faint tremor in his fingers. Without thinking, Elias spoke a single line, his voice barely more than a murmur, "Eat, little one. You don't owe me a word." The boy blinked at him, then let his eyelids sink. Sleep claimed him where he sat, the rise and fall of his chest shallow but steady. Elias stood slowly, heart caught between relief and unease. He moved the boy gently, laying him on the cot against the wall, pulling a wool blanket over his thin frame. For a moment, he lingered there, staring at the child as though afraid he might vanish with the night. When Elias stepped outside, the sky was a dome of black velvet pierced with stars. The air was cold, sharp against his lungs. He leaned against the doorframe, eyes scanning the horizon. Somewhere in the distance, wolves howled, their cries carrying on the wind like a warning. He thought of the boy's whisper earlier, that broken word, food, and something else that had slipped past his ears in the half-light. He tried to summon it back but found only a weight in his chest, heavy and foreboding. The night grew darker, and though Elias returned to his chair by the fire, his mind remained restless. Sleep did not come easy. Each creak of the cabin, each gust against the shutters, set his nerves on edge. Once, he thought he heard the boy stir, muttering in a tongue Elias could not understand, the syllables low and urgent. Only one word broke clear enough to catch, family. The sound froze him where he sat. He stared at the boy's still form, lips parted in sleep, the blanket rising and falling. Family. The word cut sharper than any blade. Elias turned his gaze toward the window, the night pressing against the glass like an unspoken threat. Somewhere out there, he knew, others must be searching. And he could not say whether they would come grateful, or wrathful, when they found what had been left in his care. That thought carried him into the restless hours before dawn, a man on the edge of a silence about to break. Dawn bled slowly into the world, painting the plains in a cold wash of gray-blue. Elias Boone sat upright in his chair by the hearth, eyes hollow from a night without rest. The boy still slept beneath the wool blanket, his breathing thin but steady. Outside, the land seemed too quiet, as though the very earth held its breath. Elias pushed himself to his feet, joints stiff, and stepped to the window. What he saw set his pulse hammering. The horizon was alive with movement, dust rising in a long, curling veil, sunlight flashing off spearheads and the dark manes of horses. 200 riders stretched across the land like a tide rolling toward his barn. Feathers caught in the wind, banners swayed, and the ground itself seemed to tremble beneath the weight of hooves. Elias gripped the sill until his knuckles whitened. They had come. For a heartbeat, he thought of reaching for his rifle, the old Winchester leaning against the wall. His instinct screamed for it. Yet the memory of the boy's whisper, family, echoed inside him. To raise a gun would be to invite the end. He stood still, every breath sharp, until the riders drew close enough for the dust to sting his eyes. They did not rush him. They formed instead a solemn line before his barn, horses stamping, nostrils flaring in the cold air. The warriors sat tall, their faces unreadable, silence heavier than any war cry. At their center rode a man older than most, his hair bound in braids streaked with gray, his chest draped in beads that caught the pale light. He dismounted with deliberate calm, boots pressing into the earth as if claiming it. Elias felt his throat tighten. The boy stirred inside the cabin, small footsteps padding across the floor, then a thin hand clutching at Elias's coat. The child's eyes, still clouded with sleep, widened at the sight beyond the window. His lips parted, a whisper torn from him like a prayer, "Father." Elias turned sharply, staring down at the boy who clung to him, trembling not with fear but with recognition. He understood then, this was no lost wanderer but the son of the man now walking toward his cabin door. The older warrior stopped a few paces away, his presence filling the silence more than words ever could. His eyes, dark and piercing, locked onto Elias's. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then, in halting English, the man said, "You fed him." It was not a question. It was an accusation softened by gratitude. Elias felt the weight of it settle on him. He nodded once, unable to summon speech. His chest swelled with a mix of fear and something stranger, respect. The boy broke free of Elias's grasp, stumbling forward until he was gathered into the man's arms. The warrior bent his head, murmuring in their tongue, voice low and thick with relief. Around them, the other riders watched, their stillness a wall Elias could not read. He braced himself for anger, for retribution, for the possibility that kindness would not shield him. But when the man lifted his head again, his expression carried no rage. Only gravity. "He is my blood," he said, voice rough. "I feared the land had swallowed him." His gaze swept back to Elias, measuring him with a silence sharper than steel. "You gave him life when hunger would have taken it. That debt is not small." Elias felt the words cut through him. He had expected to be judged a thief, an enemy, a trespasser of borders that were not his. Instead, he found himself seen in a way the town had never offered. He had not fed the boy to gain honor, he had done it because leaving a child to starve was something he could not bear. Yet here, in the eyes of strangers, that act carried weight greater than he understood. The boy clung to his father but glanced back at Elias, eyes softening. For the first time, he spoke clearly, his voice steady despite the tremor in his frame. "Thank you." The words were small, but they pierced Elias deeper than any insult ever had. One of the warriors rode forward, dismounted, and approached. He held out a small object carved from bone, smooth and pale. It was a talisman, etched with patterns Elias could not decipher. The warrior placed it in Elias's hand without a word. The gesture was enough. It was not merely a gift, it was a mark, a seal that said Elias Boone, the cursed man, had been measured and found worthy of respect. The barn, once a hollow monument to failure, now stood framed by 200 horses and the eyes of men who bore witness. Elias's shame, long fed by whispers and mockery, felt as though it had cracked and fallen away. He stood straighter, the talisman warm in his palm, the boy's gratitude still ringing in his ears. Chief Red Elk, for that was the name the murmurs among the warriors carried, rested his hand on his son's shoulder. He looked once more at Elias, his voice deep, final. "The town may call you empty. But today, you are full. We remember." Then, with a signal, the warriors mounted again. Their line shifted, dust rising as they turned back toward the horizon. The boy remained in his father's arms, his gaze lingering on Elias until distance swallowed him. Elias stood alone once more, though the silence felt different now, no longer the weight of loneliness, but the echo of something larger. He looked down at the talisman, its carvings catching the morning light, and pressed it against his chest. For the first time in years, his heart felt steady. As the dust cloud faded, he whispered to the empty land, not knowing if the words were meant for himself, for the boy, or for anyone who might ever remember, a man isn't measured by what he's lost, but by what he's willing to give. And though the horizon stretched wide and uncertain, Elias Boone stepped back into his cabin with the quiet certainty that his life had shifted. The barn was still hollow, the land still bare, but he no longer carried his emptiness alone. The memory of 200 warriors, of a boy saved, and of a debt repaid, would ride with him into every dawn that followed. The wind rose, carrying the last of the hoofbeats into silence, and Elias knew he had been changed in ways no town gossip could ever strip away.